Pikachu, one of the most recognizable icons in, well, media in general to be honest. This little rodent is up there with the greats as the face of the highest grossing franchise of all time. People say that Mickey Mouse is the face of capitalism, but he shakes in his little yellow boots at the sight of this thunderous rat and how lined his bank account is. You could probably ask anyone to describe what Pikachu looks like and they'll give you a complete answer. From his appearances in the anime as this speedy and adorable little guy, to the frankly obscene amounts of merchandise he's received over the 30 years of Pokemon. But the majority of people have probably been made familiar with Pikachu from his many sprites and models that he's had over the 9 generations of Pokemon. And boy has his sprites work in the first 5 generations changed significantly. So, with that being said, let's take a deep dive into the pixels of the most iconic rodent in history. Get fucked, Michael. And see how Game Freak has perfected it over the franchise's life. That we go by console, so that means we're starting with the original Game Boy and the Game Boy Color, with generations 1 and 2. Starting with Gen 1, you may think that this sprite from Pokemon Red and Blue is Pikachu's first ever one, but you would actually be wrong, as his original sprite is in the Japanese exclusive Pokemon Green, and is slightly different as you can see, coming out a whole 2 years before the Gen 1 sprites we all know. We're going to use the Pokemon Green sprite to get the most accurate base idea of what Pikachu should look like, so let's take a closer look. Of course, we all know what Pikachu looks like, right? No cavemen in the audience that haven't seen a Pikachu before? No? Good. We of course have the lightning bolt, the pointy ears, rosy cheeks, and everything like that, but there are a few key differences that this sprite has, the main one of which being how chunky this version of Pikachu is. This does extend to the rest of its Gen 1 sprites as well, as it's where the famous chonky shoe joke comes from, because this version of Pikachu is, for a lack of a better word, much fatter than any other sprite used in the future, except the Gigantamax Pikachu, which is literally a reference to the sheer girth of these guys. This results in things like his arms looking far smaller, which I believe is an attempt at making him look more stereotypically cute, as chubby friend-shaped animal equals adorable, at least in theory. There's one more unique aspect of this sprite in particular that I think is an interesting point to bring up, and that would be these electric particle effects surrounding him, which have never returned for any sprite in another game since. And I think this is because the developers needed to try harder to portray what made Pikachu so unique, as this was his first ever appearance to the world. Nowadays, everyone knows that Pikachu is an electric mouse, but if you say showed the Gen 4 sprite to anyone back then, they just think it was some mouse dipped in cheese and not give it a second look. So the use of these little bolts is a clear attempt to show the player that this mouse has some shocking surprises up its sleeve. A sleeve that is also probably loaded with snacks, but we won't make fun of him for that. As one final point, the changes between the original Japanese sprite and the red and blue sprite that the rest of the world got are quite extreme, with the latter having a far more dynamic and complex pose, as well as the addition of the black tips to the ears, giving Pikachu that little bit more energy that he is so iconic for. A small electric mouse should be speedy and zipping all over the place, a point that media such as the anime has always championed, so I believe that this sprite is far more appropriate for Pikachu. But that isn't to say that the green sprite is bad, merely a product of being its introduction and needing to portray what this little guy's deal is in an efficient way, so the extravagant parts of his design had to be saved for red and blue. The sprite for Pokemon Yellow tries to hit a kind of middle ground between these two, but in my opinion, the red and blue sprite is far more appropriate for the excitable Pikachu, and this sprite just really isn't that interesting in comparison. There are a couple of noticeable changes to his design here, such as the arms being longer and the cheeks standing out more, but this just feels like a finalization of the design and not an innovation, if that makes sense. Now, let's move on to the Game Boy Color and the release of Pokemon Gold, Silver, and Crystal, and there are a lot of changes to cover here, the first of which is weirdly exclusive to this generation alone, and that's being version exclusive sprites. Yeah, this is something that even I was shocked to learn about when researching for this video, but each of these 3 games have a different version of Pikachu for us to look at, so let's first see what all 3 of these have in common. We can immediately notice that, with the improved technology that these games are on, the colour depth has increased, giving Pikachu his iconic red cheeks, making his design far more varied and appealing to look at, as these 2 colours are always great complements to each other. It's why you see them paired so frequently together across many brands, for example. Next up, we can see that compared to the Gen 1 design, designs, this version is slightly more slim, which is a theme that we will continue to see throughout the upcoming games, and I believe that this is a very appropriate design choice, trading in the potential cuteness factor with making it seem more slick and speedy. Pikachu really wasn't lacking in any cuteness to begin with, so giving him some more appeal in other ways like his coolness really helped him grow on many more people, which is crucial for the mascot of your franchise. Everyone needs to love him. Next up, we can see that the design of the tail has changed slightly, with the base of it not looking nearly as thin, which helped to make it look less flimsy, cleaning up the design decently in the process. This is what all of these Gen 2 sprites feel like. Instead of getting used to the design that the Gen 1 sprite did, Gen 2's Pikachus were more experimentational with how they can present their mascot, and which personality that the fans will like the most. And speaking of, let's get into the 3 different versions of Pikachu in these 3 games, with all 3 of them portraying the mouse in slightly different ways. Firstly, the gold sprite has him jumping for joy, showing his playful and energetic side. The silver version shows a more comfy and cutesy pose, and Crystal once again is a middle road between the two, similar to what the yellow sprite was for the Gen 1 sprites. These 3 portray the entire spectrum of how Pikachu has been presented in Pokemon up to that point in media like the anime. From the adorable little mascot to the badass fighter that destroys Team Rocket like a freaking day job, really cementing Pikachu as a worthy mascot of the franchise, something that the initial sprites didn't really focus on. Everyone knew who Pikachu was at this point, so now was the perfect time to really put his appeal on full display using his sprites, which I think they've done very effectively through the new and refined details and the more interesting posing. Oh yeah, there was also a pretty important addition to the visuals of every Pokemon in these games, but we'll get to my thoughts on that in a bit. Instead of that mess, let's talk about how these sprites like to portray their shading from this point forward, using a technique called dithering. As you can see here, instead of this white highlight being one solid block all the way through, they use this checkerboard-like pattern the further the main light source gets away, which helps to make the colours blend together more, as well as being able to trick us into seeing more complex colour depth than what is actually there. This technique is, therefore, crucial for these earlier sprites where the technology doesn't allow for very high amounts of colour within their palettes, allowing for more detail to be shown despite the technological restrictions. The type that these Pikachu sprites use the most is transitional dithering, which makes the transition between 2 colours look smoother as the name suggests. But there are some examples of fill dithering too, which is used to create colours that aren't actually part of the palette, as we can see here in Pikachu's back sprite. The yellows in between the whites in the checkerboard pattern look a bit brighter to you most likely, but that isn't because there's a brighter yellow in the palette, it's just because of the dithering. Pikachu sprites need to keep their palette quite low because its design is quite basic and needs to be easily recognisable as he is the mascot. So dithering is a great way to add some subtle detail into the sprites and is used to great effect consistently across the whole franchise. Now that we've gone over that, I think we're just about done with the original Game Boy era of Pikachus, so let's jump over to Hoenn and the Game Boy Advance as we cover the 3rd generation. This era is rather minimal in terms of how much we have to talk about, as we only have one Pikachu sprite to look at, which for some reason is shared between all 3 Hoenn games and the Gen 1 remakes. It seems kind of weird for the Pokemon devs to go from making a completely new sprite for each version to one for both the mainline generation and the remakes, but the explanation might be that this is by far the highest jumping quality between generations that we've had for these sprites. The first thing that we can see is that the colour depth has been extremely upgraded. Like, we have more than one shade of yellow finally. The colours are also far more saturated than in any other generation, giving this sprite a far more cartoony vibe than the rest, which complements the pose that they chose for this sprite, being perhaps the most energetic of all 5 generations. This pose in particular is one of Pikachu's more iconic of all time, as it has been referenced as recently as 2023 in the Crown Zenith card set, and it's probably the best representation of the happiness and energy that Pikachu is loved for, which complements the saturated colours of the Gen 3 sprite. Adding to this, its hands have gone from little nubs to having fully defined fingers to match its anime appearances, making its design far more consistent as a whole over the entire franchise. Now, as I said, this is the only sprites that the 3rd generation has to offer, so what else can I fill this section with? Oh yeah, this. Well, I guess I need to get this off my chest at some point, so here goes. Pikachu Shiny Sprite is one of the most disappointing design choices in all of Pokemon, and it infuriates me to this day. Shiny Pokemon as a concept are so cool to me. These unique and extremely rare versions of the Pokemon we love with entirely different colour palettes that can completely recontextualise their design and give it new life. That sounds amazing, and in many cases, they do exactly that. Just look at Charizard, Eevee, Gyarados, and they're just the Gen 1 examples. I could go on for every single gen after Pikachu. So you'd think that for the mascot of your fucking multi-billion-dollar franchise, and one of the most beloved characters of all time in fiction, they try quite hard to make a shiny form iconic and desirable for those players dedicated enough to hunt for it. But no, the absolute best they could do is put this guy in the oven for like 20 minutes to give him a golden brown colour. And remember, no soggy bottoms on this episode of the Great British Piss Off! I did a little experiment where I went into my pixel art editor to see how much the colour actually changed numerically in terms of hue, saturation, and value, which you don't need to know the definitions for, but just know that it's how colours are different between each other. Each of these three categories can be between a value of 0 to 255, meaning that there's a maximum of 765 points of difference. You want to know how much difference between the colour of the base Gen 3 sprite and the shiny is? 25. 25 goddamn points. It's the sheer laziness of it all, and how they, at least from the way I look at it, didn't treat their mascot of their franchise with the respect that it deserves. Okay, you may come forward with the argument of, oh, the earlier shinies had no thoughts behind them, so it's unfair to the developers to expect them to give Pikachu special treatments by giving him a better shiny. But one, he's the face of your entire brand, and the developers clearly give some Pokemon special treatment, so I don't see why they couldn't here. And two, I can't agree with the opinion that they gave no thought to the significance of shiny Pokemon back then. Scizor, for example, has this green colour palette, and regardless of how good you think it looks, there's no way that this wasn't a sly nod to its pre-evolution Scyther's coloration. So there was clearly some thought put into this. Also, if the Pokemon Company really didn't care about shiny Pokemon until years later, then why was one made into a key part of Ash's team in the fucking Johto anime? They obviously cared about making shinies appealing to people from the moment they were released, so obviously people would try to find Pikachu shiny. Imagine the playground bragging rights you would have by having the shiny of freaking Pikachu! But no, most people would barely be able to tell the difference and therefore couldn't care less. And that's what upsets me the most. You made the rarest version of your mascot boring. You could have given him the ugliest shiny imaginable, and I would still prefer it to this, because at least it would have shown some effort. But this, it looks outright lazy, and that sucks. Pikachu deserves so much better than that. Okay, that is probably the most annoyed that you're going to see me on this channel, so apologies for the sudden shift in tone there, but I needed to stress just how odd of a dip in Pikachu's quality his shiny is compared to the rest of the sprite work in this generation. Sure, Pikachu only had one sprite compared to the last generation's 3, but it's a clear case of quality over quantity, because it's clear that they really did go all out with making his design as expressive and energetic as possible, while making it look more vibrant and appealing through the new colour scheme that they now have access to with the Game Boy Advance. Well, with all that being behind us now, we have greener pastures ahead to get to as we move through to the final console in this video, being the DS and generations 4 and 5, and the many innovations they brought. And here we are at the most advanced console in this video, and with it, the highest quality Pikachu sprites the franchise has to offer, at least in an objective sense. Starting with Generation 4, we have 3 main sprites to look at, being the Diamond and Pearl sprite, the Platinum sprite, and the Heart Gold Soul Silver sprite. The Diamond and Pearl Pikachu definitely falls into the cute side of these sprites, with the arms pointed together for example, and the colour palette chosen for these sprites is a bit less saturated than the previous generation, finding a middle ground between the relaxed and infectious energy of the previous Pikachu. This sprite in particular, for some reason, has the tail on the left hand side instead of the right, unlike pretty much every other one, which changes how the lighting worked for this one compared to the rest, which is an odd design choice, but is fair for the first sprite of Generation 4. It needed something to stand out. The Platinum sprite really doesn't have much to talk about that is different from the Diamond and Pearl sprite, except for the pose being a bit more generic like any other Pikachu, with the tail on the right hand side, and the smile actually being a bigger focus than in other sprites. But the Heart Gold Soul console's silver sprites brings Pikachu back to the energetic and upbeat side, as well as portraying far more positive emotion than any other sprites so far. Most of the previous sprites don't go any further than cute and excited mouse, but this one has Pikachu actively waving like it's greeting you whenever it gets sent out, giving a sense of personality that hasn't been very explicit until this sprite, which I think is a very fitting thing to give to Pikachu of all Pokemon. Now for the unique design choices of this generation, the main one of which being the introduction of gender differences between Pokemon, and these were rather forgettable across the board until many generations later with Pokemon like Pyro. Like seriously, half of these are similar to those spot the difference games that 6-year-olds play. Did you even notice the difference between the male and female Rattata while they were on screen? Thankfully, Pikachu actually fared pretty well in this new design gimmick, with a pretty noticeable and iconic change to the tail, making the tip a little heart, further emphasising the cuteness of the female Pikachus. Yes, I do wish that they could have done more, as sexual dimorphism, the concept of different sexes within a species having vastly different designs, is such an interesting and compelling way of adding entirely new dimensions to a Pokemon's design. So while yes, a heart tail is rather cute and fits into the playful aspect of Pokemon as a whole, I feel like there was a well of amazing potential that went largely untapped. However, I can't really blame the developers on this, as there are very minimal differences between the male and female mice despite the obvious, and they do need to keep Pikachu's design consistent to not alienate any of their audience, but maybe some creative liberties could have been made here. I'm not sure, maybe I'm asking too much. What I do know is that these Gen 4 sprites do a great job of being comfortable and quality, which is always the best benchmark to hit for the first games of a new console generation, with plenty of the personality and visual appeal that includes everything we love about Pikachu. Now we get on to the innovations of Generation 5, and while we only have one sprite to look at here, the visually able of you may be able to see it's moving. Yup, Pokemon Black and White introduced a beloved animated sprite, and I believe that this was the perfect time to introduce them. The sprites of Generation 4 feel like the perfection of the static Pikachu sprites on the DS, with a great balance of cuteness and coolness with some extra additions and gimmicks added on, such as the gender differences. So Gen 5 really needed to shake up the formula in a big way, just like it did for the rest of the franchise as a whole, as Pokemon Black and White were meant to be like a softer reset for the franchise. The bigger emphasis on the story, the first games having an exclusively Unnovan Pokedex, and many other things made this generation arguably the most innovative since Gen 1, and the sprites being animated fit into that perfectly. Looking at the animation itself, I would love to go frame by frame to analyse how they're animated exactly, but the animation has 97 frames to look at, so looking through all of them would be utterly idiotic. So, how about we explain why the hell the animation needs that many frames first? Well, the sprites aren't animated in a traditional sense, like say, the running animations from any previous games, as instead of them being frame by frame and being able to be put on a sprite sheet like this, these sprites are divided into multiple segments and move around independently over the course of the animation, not being locked to any sort of grid like the majority of pixel art is. This method of animation is unique and has very little precedent across gaming as a whole, which gives these sprites a very individual smoothness to them, as they can get away with using extortionate amount of frames to convey smoothness, while also having realistic and believable movement that doesn't look very sluggish, which is often the consequence of overdoing an animation's frame count. It's why things like attack animations tend to have minimal frames to convey their speed. If you put too many frames in it, it just becomes slow and very unsatisfying to watch. However, with the smoothness of this style comes some sacrifices, most notable of which being these very messy breaks in the pixel grids that, when analysed in even a bit of detail, become very noticeable and ugly, honestly. Now, obviously there are some special circumstances that need to be taken into account here, mainly that the lower resolution of the DS screen can hide these imperfections of the animation quite nicely. So in the context of the game specifically, these are not the biggest deal in the world and ultimately don't impact the visuals too much. The animation is still appealing and fits Pikachu well enough. You could make a similar argument to that of smear frames as well, being that these imperfections are never meant to be seen by anyone on their own, and only exist to make the animation smoother. And I would agree for the most part, but there lies the main issue with this animation. These breaks in the grid do stick out in ways that smear frames and other similar concepts really shouldn't, and in Pikachu's case, I can definitely see how things like his tail become very jagged, almost like it's been crumpled up like a piece of paper and unfolded back with all these creases, preventing these animations from being truly perfect. Regardless of my criticisms, animation in context will always be the metric that I mainly judge them on, and in this case, on a smaller screen with lower resolution, the animation really does bring this mascot to life like no other game has before, revitalizing the energy and appeal that Pikachu is known for, and delivering one of the best visual interpretations that we have all seen for Pikachu ever. All art is flawed at the end of the day, but It's the mixture of strengths and shortcomings that make art truly appealing and worth getting invested in, really showing that pixel art, especially that of Pikachu, isn't just black and white. Okay, sorry for that corny and dramatic ending there, but I feel like it was appropriate for describing how Pikachu has been portrayed across all of these sprites. He's a surprisingly complex character with many personalities and appeals to so many people, all of which have been portrayed in many ways all the way from the 90s until now, and I really do hope that I've been able to make these appeals clear to you today. While the franchise as a whole may have moved on to the more technologically advanced 3D models, the pixel versions of Pikachu are what many people, myself included, grew up with and adored for many years, so they deserve all the praise I can give, really. So, if you enjoyed my thoughts on these sprites, make sure to zap the like and subscribe buttons, and as always, I'll see you when I see you. Bye!